Friday, the 1st of September, 1939. After a humid night that offered little sleep, I pedalled to work with my shirt clinging to my back. The dark sky threatened thunder. Reluctantly, I stepped across the threshold of the door to the bakery, wedged open to allow a non-existent breeze to clear the heat generated by the ovens. In the yellow light of the electric lamps, a mist of flour dust hung in the air. As usual, my day began with a sack full of Brötchen, German rolls, on my shoulder, and a long list of deliveries to the bags hanging on the door handles of our customers, a welcome respite from the stifling heat of the ovens. It was only when I noticed the absence of the routine bickering pouring from the open window of the flat at 52 Memler Strasse, home of the binders, that I became fully aware of the ominous stillness haunting the area. I arrived back at the bakery to hear the radio playing the usual background music. Following Fritz's example, I stripped to my vest and helped him mix a fresh batch of dough. A fanfare interrupted the program, the signal that an important announcement was about to follow. We stopped work to listen to the broadcast of a speech given by Hitler to the German parliament earlier that morning, a speech in which he said our troops were in action in Poland. He ended with the declaration, "Our will and German steel will see us through." Fritz shook his head. "I knew this was coming," he sighed. That weekend, Britain and France declared war on Germany. On Monday morning, I waved to the Jewish butcher in Palisadenstrasse. As ever, he walked in his knee-high boots with one foot on the pavement, the other on the road. "Guten Morgen, Herr Grünfeld," I called. Herr Grünfeld grunted through his long, frizzled grey beard. Not for us Jews. December 1939. Spring 1940. Just after my 16th birthday, the temperature plummeted, signalling the start of a colder-than-usual winter with day after day of sub-zero temperatures. For once, the prospect of working in the heat of the bakery seemed almost inviting. I pedalled more vigorously than usual, keeping close to the ghostly white lines painted on the curbs to make driving safer in the absence of street lighting. I arrived at the bakery to find Fritz, now a journeyman baker, working alone. As usual, we shook hands in greeting. "Where's the chief?" I asked. Fritz laughed. "He's the first to be drafted, Wehrmacht. Frau Glaser told me he was posted to a military bakery just outside the city. I wonder when our turn will come," I mused. "Who knows, but the loss of old man Glaser is bad news for us, one less pair of hands. As I see it, this war is getting far too serious. Mark my words, Erwin, those bombs that fell in Landsberger Strasse were just the first. Did you see the damage?" "Naja, I went with my parents at the weekend. Big crowds, but not much to see. A few roof tiles blown off. The police were gathering up the leaflets the plane dropped." With Christmas approaching, the bakery was busier than ever, and by the time it came to sweeping up at the end of the day, the smell of freshly baked bread turned my stomach. "You did well, kid," said Fritz in a fake American accent. Until recently, he had frequented the cinema in Potsdamer Platz to watch American movies, but Reichsminister Goebbels put an end to that when he declared them too foreign for Aryan eyes. "See you tomorrow," I said, turning at last for the door. As my hand clasped the doorknob, Fritz called, "Erwin." I stopped with the door opened just a little, eager to make the best of what remained of the furtive December daylight. "Erwin," he repeated, "you haven't heard the important news yet." His tone was almost musical, but full of irony. "What news?" "We start at 3 o'clock tomorrow." Poor Fritz was so busy he never even had time to go home. For a while I too slept in the bakery, but I soon became too drained to keep this up. In order to arrive at work on time, I now had to coax my weary body from bed at 2:15 until one spring morning. When I reported for work, I was surprised to find Herr Glaser already busy mixing the dough for the Brötchen. "Guten Morgen, Erwin," said Herr Glaser, pointing to his feet. It seems they were not made for army boots after all. My doubts about the truth of Herr Glaser's claim to have some undefined medical condition affecting his feet dispelled, the prospect of shorter working hours immediately lifted my spirits. Sure enough, at the end of that day, Herr Glaser announced, "Work starts at 4 a.m. tomorrow. We keep going until all the orders are finished." A few weeks later, as if to make up for their loss of Herr Glaser, the Wehrmacht drafted Fritz into its ranks. When I arrived home that evening, there must have been a glum look on my face. "What's troubling you, Erwi?" asked Mutti. Fritz was drafted it's back to a 3 a.m. start tomorrow. I flopped into my father's armchair, already pulled close to the heat of the Kachelofen. Mama, I'm sick of the baking trade. But it's a good trade, Irvi. You'll get used to the long hours. I consoled myself with the thought that on Saturday evenings I was still able to meet up with my best friends Horst Musch and Gunther Schmidt. Together we were the three musketeers, classmates who became inseparable from our first days at school. Muschi had always been good at drawing and had taken up an apprenticeship as a graphic artist. Schmidti had a job with the Reichsbahn, the German National Railway. Most Saturdays we visited the Plaza Theatre where variety shows played. Sometimes we tried our luck with the local girls, but our advances invariably met with little success. The Leibstandarte held a summer recruitment drive in 1940. Disillusioned and frustrated by the long working hours as a baker, I picked up an application form from the office of the Wehrmacht High Command in Bendlerstrasse. In it was provision for the nomination of alternative units in case the applicant failed to match up to the entry requirements of Hitler's elite military force. My brother Horst, who was now serving as a Luftwaffe telephonist at the Air Ministry, advised me to name the Fliegerabwehrkanonen, flak unit of the Luftwaffe, as second choice. I filled in the form in my neatest handwriting and within a week received an order to attend a hall in Alexanderplatz for a medical examination. On a gloriously sunny June day, I made my way to the hall where I had previously taken a few ballroom dancing lessons in the hope of one day impressing a future girlfriend. Inside the hall, 100 other young men stood around wondering what would happen next. Mostly they were between the ages of 16 and 17, although there were a few who were a bit older. An Unterscharführer, sergeant of the Leibstandarte, pushed among us, arranging us into neat rows. A hush fell on the waiting hopefuls when a high-ranking officer in an immaculate uniform appeared on the stage. "Remove your clothes and set them in a neat bundle at your feet," announced the officer. Stripping naked in public was a new experience for me. I felt the blood rush to my cheeks as I glanced at the other would-be recruits, several of whom still wore underpants. "Remove all clothing, strip everything. Everything," roared the Unterscharführer. "Never mind looking at each other. It's not a bloody beauty parade. You were given an order. Get on with it." The officer left the stage and began his inspection. I swear I could sense his eyes scrutinizing every inch of my naked flesh as he passed behind me. The applicant standing next to me jerked forward a little. Having completed his inspection, the officer made an announcement. "Those of you who were tapped on the shoulder are dismissed. Have your hair cut before you try again." A wave of hope, of relief, swelled my spirits. I had passed the first stage of the selection process and dared to think that the tedium of the bakery would soon end. Then the real inspection got underway. A doctor measured my chest and asked questions about my past illnesses and operation scars, with every answer fastidiously recorded in his file. Then, still naked, I was required to pull back my foreskin to allow the doctor to examine my penis, not the sort of weapons inspection I had anticipated. Endless questions by an officer probed every part of my life to make sure there were no Jewish connections. "Why do you want to join the Leibstandarte?" he asked. "Because I am a Berliner and tall," I answered with the simple innocence of youth. On a snowy day in January 1941, a letter arrived from the Wehrmacht High Command. My mother looked on as my trembling fingers opened the brown envelope. The blood drained from my face in disappointment as I read. "What does it say, Irvi?" "The Luftwaffe, Mama, the flak unit." "That's good, Irvi. Your father will be happy. He was worried about you getting into the Leibstandarte. They're always in the thick of the fighting." Straight away I shook off my disappointment and headed for the door. "Where are you going, Irvi?" "To the recruiting office, Mama. There must have been some mistake." I arrived at the recruiting office to find the reception area already packed and took my place in a slowly moving queue. The officer in charge asked why I had come, and I told him the whole story about receiving my call-up papers from the Luftwaffe. Then something quite out of the ordinary happened. Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler, chief of the SS and the second most famous man in Germany, strode into the office and stopped to exchange a few words with the men in the queue. To my astonishment, he asked where I lived and if I was looking forward to life as a Leibstandarte recruit. Full of hope, I spilled my story about how I thought the recruiting office had made a mistake by assigning me to the flak unit. "I'll see what I can do about it," he said, before disappearing into a back office. I had almost resigned myself to wearing the blue uniform of the Luftwaffe when Himmler reappeared and made straight for me. "You will hear from us soon," said the bespectacled Reichsführer. In February 1941, my call-up papers from the Leibstandarte arrived. I was overjoyed that the whole business with the bakery would soon be over, and that, from now on, life would take a more exciting turn. Special radio announcements, one after the other, proclaimed our military successes. What did I have to lose? I was desperate to play my part before the Endsieg, our ultimate and inevitable victory. Feeling like a student who had just won a coveted place at an elite university, there was, despite the sunless sky, a spring in my step as I made my way along Finkenstein Aller on May Day morning 1941. I stopped for a moment in front of the closed main gate to the barracks to admire the Ewigen Rottenführer, eternal corporals. At about 4 meters tall, these statues formed an imposing welcome. I took a long, deep breath before making my way to the sentry at the side gate, who looked at my pass and, with a sharp nod, welcomed me to my new world. Walking briskly across the assembly area, I joined the crowd of recruits gathered in front of the 4 central pillars of the main building. A parapet above the pillars carried the words, "Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler." Perched above the parapet, an enormous statue of an eagle, wings half outstretched as if testing the wind, surveyed its domain. At last I could believe that my days as a baker were over, that my metamorphosis into a soldier of Germany's most elite regiment was about to begin. As I waited impatiently with my fellow recruits, a soldier wearing riding breeches materialized mysteriously, as if from thin air. The single silver pip on the dark mirror of his tunic collar identified his rank as that of Unterscharführer. "I am the Laughing Devil," he cackled as his eerily long fingers moved near his pointed face, making slow movements as if conducting an invisible orchestra. "Your Unteroffizier vom Dienst for today. Follow me." Our Unteroffizier vom Dienst, UVD duty NCO, led us to a large sports hall smelling of beeswax polish laced with sweat. In the centre of the hall was a boxing ring, and against the walls, sports apparatus of many different kinds was stored. For the best part of an hour, we hung around self-consciously looking at each other until the Laughing Devil returned to escort us to the dining hall for a meal of sandwiches and sausage meat. After we had eaten, we returned to the sports hall, where an officer explained the regulations that governed our stay in the barracks. Blankets were distributed, and suddenly it was lights out. With 200 other restless young men sharing the hard floor of the hall, I hardly got a wink of sleep. At 7 a.m., the Laughing Devil appeared to direct us to the washrooms. "Shave and make sure your fingernails are clean. When you have finished washing, you will be allocated to your platoons before proceeding to your dormitories." The tallest men, giants measuring upwards of 190 centimeters, made up the first platoon. With my 186 Setiats, I joined the second of the 4 platoons billeted in the Hermann Göring block, one of 4 named after prominent figures in the Reich. 3 stairways served our sleeping quarters on the top floor. Upward traffic used the left and middle stairwells, while the 3rd stairwell served only as an exit. This, explained the Laughing Devil, would avoid confusion if the need arose to empty the barracks quickly. Each room had 6 sets of double bunks. Between each set of bunks was a metal locker. "The lockers are to be left open. A Leibstandarte man is trustworthy," said the Laughing Devil. "He will never steal from his Kameraden. Loyalty and honour. From now on, these are your guiding principles at all times. You will store your uniforms in a particular order. Long coat, first uniform, second uniform, then drill suit. The drill suit will be your daily wear while training. The space in the lower part of the locker is where you will store your boots. 1 pair to be worn while on watch, and a second pair used in training, and 1 pair of dress shoes which are to be kept clean at all times. In the uppermost section of the locker, you will hang your shirts and underwear. Steel helmets and backpacks are stored on top of the lockers. Belts and ties must be hung on the hooks on the back of the door. Finally, there is a small but adequate space at the left-hand side for bread and fillings, such as butter and jam. In this part of the locker you will also store plates, cutlery and cups. And remember, I check daily to see that everything is kept clean. and in the correct place. Later that day, we collected our uniforms from the quartermaster's store, and between us, somehow managed to remember the list of instructions issued by the Laughing Devil. Like a child, I marvelled at the name Adolf Hitler sewn in silver thread onto the cuff band on the left arm of my tunic. The following morning, we reported for a medical examination that would establish our blood groups. My blood group proved to be typo. A doctor inscribed this letter by means of small cuts, made with a scalpel on the inside of my left arm, near the armpit, a mark that is still discernible after more than 70 years. I received my Soldbuch, passbook, and aluminium dog tag. Both carried the identification code 17. Company number 15, OSS Verfügungstruppe. The elliptical dog tag had 3 slits down the middle, on the long axis. This made it quick and easy to break off half the tag, while still leaving the other half on the chain around the neck of a dead soldier, whose identity might otherwise be difficult to establish. Of course, my young mind did not dwell on such grisly matters. Training began in earnest. At first roll call, our company commander, Obersturmführer Hans Becker, welcomed us recruits. Even though it was not quite midway through 1941, Becker was already an experienced combat commander, having served in France, Poland, and Greece. Our instructors then examined our fingernails for cleanliness, boots for shine, faces for signs of forbidden stubble, hair for length, and handkerchiefs for neatness. They opened up our backpacks to check the cleaning kit, toothbrush, and the other items we would need when on active duty. Finally, an officer announced the password for the day. Endless drills formed the core of our activities during the following weeks until our company merged with another to form the 5, Waschbataillon Berlin, a unit that performed guard duties in and around the city. Life as a recruit suited me, and I have to admit that the months that followed were some of the happiest times of my life, though by the time lights out came around, I was often thoroughly exhausted and perhaps closer to tears than to laughter. On 4 occasions, I stood sentry at the southern end of the Lichterfelder compound close to the vehicle workshops and a cage in which lived a brown bear. The animal was a gift presented to the Leibstandarte during the recent campaign in Greece, and its antics provided amusement for a weary sentry. On another occasion, I was on guard duty at the lobby of offices occupied by SS Gruppenführer Leo von Jena, a high-ranking and highly decorated officer, a typical officer type of the old style from the First World War. When the doorbell rang, I would open the door and examine the documents of every visitor, noting their name in a logbook even if it was von Jena himself. These were the regulations, and I carried them out without exception. Only twice did my duty rota take me to the gardens of the Reichskanzlei, a 500-metre stretch of asphalt at the rear of the barracks, known among us recruits as Plattfuß Alley, Flatfoot Alley, provided the scene for marching practice with sessions often lasting several hours. Usually we warmed up with the basic infantry commands and rifle drill, eyes straight, shoulder arms, march. Up and down we marched until the commands sank in. Then the UVD would roar, Achtung! The signal for us to throw our legs high in the air, in the Paradmarsch, commonly referred to as the goose step. Accompanying our instructors were regimental bandsmen who played the Badenweiler Marsch, chosen by the Führer himself as the signature tune of the Leibstandarte, and only played publicly when he was in residence in Berlin. If anyone failed to perform well, he received extra lessons. I recall that one of the recruits had difficulty in holding his head at the correct angle. The UVD tied a brick to the poor man's ear with a shoelace, and it stayed there until he overcame his deficiency. In the evenings, if we were free, we could go to one of 2 canteens in the barracks, where we could buy things for our personal use such as toothpaste, razor blades and biscuits. Like many of my fellow recruits, I bought a peaked cap and immediately removed the wire bracing to give it a more casual appearance. Beer was also available, and if we had visitors, we could take them to the canteen for a drink. My brother Horst, who was an Unteroffizier in the Luftwaffe at the time, usually accompanied me to the dormitory when he visited. There was also a cinema, located in a long, narrow room on the first floor of the main building. Capable of accommodating an audience of several hundred, it showed all the latest films, including Stukas, a film in which Wagner's Götterdämmerung fills a jaded young pilot with the spirit to continue to risk his life for the future of the fatherland. Although there were exciting scenes of aerial combat, the message conveyed by the film was clear. We too should show the same spirit of sacrifice as the young hero. I was among the first of the recruits granted leave. This was thanks to my brother, who one Sunday dropped by the barracks with his new fiancée. At the orderly's office, he asked the Unteroffizier vom Dienst to issue a pass for me so that I could spend a few hours outside the barracks with them. Permission granted, he signed a paper saying that he would be responsible for my return by a specified time. We went to a local bar in Lichterfelde and had coffee and cakes and just a single glass of beer, since it was frowned upon for Leibstandarte men, the elite soldiers of Germany, to be seen drinking too much alcohol outside the barracks. Inside the canteen, this rule was cast aside, and I spent several enjoyable evenings drinking beer and singing soldiers' songs with my new Kameraden. We passed between the larger-than-life stone reliefs of a naked man and woman either side of the double wooden doors leading to the Lichterfelde Barracks swimming pool. Inside, an instructor issued swimming shorts. "Get into these diving area in 5 minutes," he said. As a schoolboy, the hours I had spent shivering at the poolside because of my appendix operation while my classmates enjoyed swimming lessons had finally caught up with me. I couldn't swim. At the deep end of the pool, an enormous Oberscharführer, his face as hard and bright as the finest Kruppstahl, waited with a clipboard in hand. "Watch the instructor," ordered the Oberscharführer. "Nothing complicated, just do as he does." The instructor trotted up the stairs of the 10-meter diving tower. He stopped for a moment at the edge of the uppermost platform before stepping into the void, and, feet first, plummeted into the water only a few meters from where I stood. After what seemed to me an eternity, he surfaced and swam to the ladder at the side of the pool. "Form a line at the bottom of the tower. Don't worry if you can't swim," said the Oberscharführer. "The instructor will pull you out if you get into trouble." My heart raced. I was not fond of water and even less fond of heights. The presence of the instructor offered little comfort. The Oberscharführer glanced at his clipboard. "Bartmann, you're first." I grabbed the handrail and began climbing the steps, convinced that the tower was swaying under my feet. At the top of the tower, I reluctantly let go the handrail and stepped up to the edge of the precipice. Far below, the reflected light from the tall windows at the far end of the hall waltzed woozily on the surface of the water. To falter, even for a second, would have meant instant dismissal from the Waffen-SS. I took a deep breath, sealing the air in my lungs with lips pressed hard against each other, and stepped into the unknown. The rush of air gave way to the crash of water against my eardrums. Tiny bubbles fizzed over my skin. When I opened my eyes, everything appeared blurred, bathed in milky blue light, silent. My arms flailed instinctively, propelling me upwards with agonizing slowness. At last, with lungs clamoring for new air, I let go a gasp of triumph as my head broke the surface, handrail, and stepped up to the edge of the precipice. Far below, the reflected light from the tall windows at the far end of the hall waltzed woozily on the surface of the water. To falter, even for a second, would have meant instant dismissal from the Waffen-SS. I took a deep breath, sealing the air in my lungs with lips pressed hard against each other, and stepped into the unknown. The rush of air gave way to the crash of water against my eardrums. Tiny bubbles fizzed over my skin. When I opened my eyes, everything appeared blurred, bathed in milky blue light, silent. My arms flailed instinctively, propelling me upwards with agonizing slowness. At last, with lungs clamoring for new air, I let go a gasp of triumph as my head broke the surface. The sidearm issued to the Leibstandarte during training was the Pistole 08, the Luger. It hung comfortably in its holster, and for a handgun was highly accurate, though it was prone to jam if mud or sand got into the mechanism. In a break from the usual routine, an instructor introduced the weapon to us in our dormitory. "Now listen carefully," he said. "At the firing range, I will issue each man with 5 cartridges at a time. Load them into the magazine and count them as you fire," warned the instructor in a serious tone. After lunch, we took our 08S to the indoor range in the barracks, firing at targets just 25 meters away. At first, my shots missed the target completely, but my aim soon improved. When shooting practice was finished, the instructor gathered us together. "Before you return to your dormitory to clean new weapons, I must warn you that the Pistole 08 is a little bit different from other pistols. When the barrel is removed from the hand grip, a little spring is exposed which, if pressed, releases the firing bolt. If there is a cartridge in the firing chamber, this can happen if you didn't bother to count the number of rounds fired. The bolt will strike the cartridge. Back in the dormitory, as we cleaned our 08S, a loud crack echoed through the room. In stunned silence, everyone looked around to see what had happened. The reek of cordite filled the air. Sitting on the bunk directly opposite my own, Max, a blonde-haired recruit from around Kiel, clasped his knee with both hands. Blood oozed between his fingers. Attracted by the sound of the shot, the Laughing Devil rushed into the dormitory. "What in the name of God happened here?" he screamed. "Always make sure you count the shots fired." His mood softened as he examined Max's wound and said, "Remember, pain is in the brain." The rifles issued to us were the Gewehr 98 model from the First World War, but since all the recruits in the Leibstandarte were tall, the large size of these old weapons suited us just fine. The particular weapon that came to me had the most beautiful grain pattern on the butt, which, polished to perfection over the years, was much admired by my Kameraden. At a firing range just outside Berlin, we practiced shooting at targets from prone, kneeling and standing positions. After every shot we reported to the officer in charge, who observed the target through binoculars, telling him where we thought the bullet had struck. After a few days, I became something of a marksman. With the basic shooting skills mastered, we began combat training. In a mock assault on an enemy trench, I threw myself to the ground and began firing from the prone position. A bolt of pain coursed through my legs. "Heels must lie flat on the ground," roared the instructor, standing on my ankles, "unless you want to lose them to bullets or shrapnel." Hardly able to walk, I reported to the medical room the following morning. The doctor examined my badly swollen ankles and asked how I came by them. I described the circumstances leading to my injuries and received 2 days' bed rest, during which I learned that Kompaniführer Becker had summoned the instructor to discuss the incident. A few days later, I chanced across the instructor in a corridor. "Ah, Bartmann," he said with a malicious gleam in his eye, "report to my dormitory in 10 minutes in full parade uniform." The instructor greeted my arrival with a quizzical look. "Did I not say to you to come in sports kit? Get changed, back here in 5 minutes." When I returned, he smiled sadistically. 50 knee bends. I knew what was coming. Sports kit, knee bends, parade uniform, sports kit, a cycle that soon had sweat streaming from every pore in my body. How long I would have to endure this punishment would depend on the mood of my tormentor. In the event, he lost interest after about an hour. Maskenball, as we soldiers called this ordeal, was over, but my respite was short-lived. "Now," said the instructor, "I want every pair of boots in this dormitory cleaned till they are spotless." After a hard day on Plattfuss Alle, my Kameraden were already fast asleep by the time I finished my turn to clean the dormitory. Only after the UVD had inspected my work and was satisfied with what he found would he allow me to go to bed. Fighting to keep my eyes open, I heard footsteps approach in the stairwell. The door opened to reveal the Laughing Devil. Theatrically, he took a pair of white cotton gloves from his pocket. "Now, let's see what sort of job you've made," he said, sliding his long fingers into the gloves. With a peculiar grin on his face, he opened the door of every locker to scrutinize the contents and found no grounds for complaint. Even the coffee pot on the table was spotless. I had taken every precaution to avoid presenting him with an excuse to keep me from collapsing into my bed, and had just let go the faintest sigh of relief when he pointed to an iron bracket supporting the roof joists, high in the corner of the room. "I'll have a look up there," he announced, looking around the room. "Bring that table over." Even if he stands on the table, I thought, the bracket would still be out of his reach. Nevertheless, I dragged the table to the desired spot. The Laughing Devil clambered onto the table and peered up towards the bracket. "I'll need something else to stand on. Fetch me something so I can get higher." I brought a little table, the one we used while playing cards or chess, and placed it on top of the large table directly under the bracket. He looked up at the bracket once more. "I'll need something else. A stool." As the Laughing Devil stood on the stool perched on top of 2 tables, he ran his gloved hand along the top of the bracket, a daring act considering the height. When he clambered down, he stood close to me and moved his gloved hands in front of my nose, like a mime artist pressing against an invisible wall. "What?" he asked, head tilted slightly to one side. "Do you call that?" "Dust, Unterscharführer," I replied shamefacedly. In the Leibstandarte, we never addressed anyone of higher rank as Herr, as was necessary in the Wehrmacht. Like a flash of lightning, the gloved hands clapped together. A cloud of dust swirled around my face. I coughed and sneezed. "I want the whole place washed. I'll be back later to check that everything is in order." I shook my head in disbelief as the Laughing Devil's cackle echoed in the stairwell, and with a weary sigh, steeled myself for the irksome task. I wiped every one of the high brackets, emptied every locker and washed them inside and out. I scrubbed the floor. My roommates complained about the noise, so I hurried to finish so they could get back to sleep. Exhausted, I finally sat down and listened above the snores of my Kameraden for the approach of the Laughing Devil's footsteps. At about 3 a.m., Kompanie-Führer Becker appeared and asked why I was still awake. I told him what had happened. "Get to bed," he said. "I'll see to all this." Because of all this, Becker gave the Laughing Devil another 24 hours UVD duty, and I did my best to avoid him for a while. On the assembly area, under the ever-vigilant statue of the eagle on the parapet, we formed into ranks to make up 3 sides of a square, in front of Obersturmführer Hans Becker and a platoon leader carrying the regimental standard. At a signal from Becker, the platoon leader lowered the standard, its gold-braided borders glinting in the sunlight, until the flagpole was horizontal. Representatives from each platoon marched up to place their left hand on the pole, the signal for everyone present to raise their right hand. Obersturmführer Hans Becker read the Fahneneid, an oath that echoed that of the medieval Teutonic Knights, which my schoolteacher Herr Wirth had described to my class some years earlier. "I swear to you, Adolf Hitler, Führer and Chancellor of the German nation, loyalty and bravery. I vow to you, and to my superiors appointed by you, obedience unto death. So help me God." Shoulders thrown back in pride, I repeated the oath to pledge my life to the Führer. Every man polished his boots until they shone, brushed his uniform until not a single speck of dust remained. What a glorious sight we were. I was looking forward to my first official leave. We had breakfast in the dormitory. The Laughing Devil popped in to make sure we lived up to the high expectations of the Leibstandarte, and, satisfied with our appearance, nodded in approval before retreating down the stairwell. Elated chatter, reminiscent of the sound of a school playground, filled the room as we waited for dismissal. Half an hour later, the Laughing Devil's head appeared round the door. "Kompanie-Führer Becker wishes to give you a little talk assembly area in 5 minutes." We straightened our caps and uniforms and rushed for the stairs. The Laughing Devil and Kompanie-Führer Becker were already waiting for us on the assembly area. Achtung, right dress, eyes front. There was a shuffling of feet as we formed smartly into precise rows under a faultless, shimmering blue sky. "Kameraden," said Kompanie-Führer Becker solemnly, "I have some unwelcome news for you. I regret to inform you that the barrack gates are now closed. Leave is cancelled until further notice." After a long pause, he continued his address. "This morning, the Führer made a special radio announcement. I have a transcript of that announcement which I will now read to you." Stern-faced, Becker reached the final sentence. "The fate of Europe and the future of the Reich are in your hands, and may God help us in this struggle." We stood in silence, drinking in the enormity of the announcement. We were at war with Russia. "Soldiers of the Leibstandarte," said the Laughing Devil, eyes wide and piercing, voice quivering with pride. "You know what to do when you return to your dormitories. You must be prepared to be underway at a blink of an eye. Company dismiss." Fueled by the realization that training, marching practice, and guard duty were at an end, an excited murmur rose up as we made our way back to our dormitories. Operation Barbarossa, the attack on the Bolsheviks, was underway. Our leaders had anticipated that the Russians, despite their treaty with us, would take the opportunity to attack our rear, just as we seemed on the verge of invading England. To ward off this danger, our troops were advancing on a front that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. We packed our rucksacks and waited. The sound of trucks manoeuvring in the assembly area at first drew everyone to the windows, but still there was no call to action. The excited babble faded to resigned silence. Evening mealtime passed without any further news. It grew dark as we lay on our bunks, dressed in full uniform apart from our boots. After morning roll call, we resumed our usual routine. The day passed without further event, and after a spell on sentry duty, I bumped into Max. "Did you hear about Becker?" "I was on guard duty, haven't spoken to anyone," I replied. "He's been shot, carted off to the SS hospital on Unter den Eichen." It was astonishing news. "Who did it?" "A sentry at the Reichskanzlei, that's the rumour," replied Max. No one knew any of the details of the shooting, but some wild rumours were already spinning round the barracks. Later, we discovered that Becker had been checking out the guard at the Reichskanzlei by creeping amongst the bushes. Unfortunately, he failed to answer when asked for the password, and the sentry fired a single shot. The bullet entered the front of Becker's right leg near the groin and passed out at the rear. For his outstanding obedience to orders, the guard was immediately promoted to the rank of Oberschützen, Rifleman First Class. Things could have turned out a lot worse for the guard, and for Becker. At the start of August 1941, we received news of our imminent posting to a field unit. Things went wrong for me a short time later. An infection developed in my right index finger after a minor injury, and the tip required lancing to allow the pus to drain. The day before we were due to leave Lichterfelde, I reported to the company doctor. "Schütze Bartmann, I see that your finger has not yet completely healed," he said, glancing at the notes on his desk. "Obersturmführer, it doesn't stop me using a weapon. Pain is in the brain," I replied with the maxim drilled into every recruit. The doctor made a brief, irritated smile. "Nevertheless, I must offer you the chance to remain in Berlin until your injury is completely healed." "I would prefer to be with my Kameraden," I answered with an involuntary hint of pleading in my voice. The doctor nodded as he took a pen from the holder on his desk and added a few lines to the documents on the table. "Don't worry," he said. "You will be leaving tomorrow, on the same train as your Kameraden." After morning roll call, every man received a large salami sausage, a tin of meat, and some butter and bread. We stuffed them into our backpacks and lined up to march the short distance to the rail station in Lichterfelde, where the platform was already crowded with civilians and soldiers. A military band played strident march music, reinforcing the illusion of invulnerability in us, its willing victims. Obergruppenführer von Jena gave a speech designed to make us feel like heroes that would slay the red bear of Bolshevism and rescue European culture. When von Jena's pep talk was finished, we crammed enthusiastically into the carriages of the waiting train. Everyone tried to jostle his way to a window, to look out onto the colourful scene on the platform. 16 or 17-year-old girls from the Bund Deutscher Mädeln, League of German Girls, waved little red flags with swastikas while a company of HJ cheered. A shrill whistle pierced the incongruous holiday-like atmosphere, and the military band played Preußen's Gloria as the locomotive snorted like some black mechanical dragon impatient to be underway. Those inside the carriage jerked back in unison as the train lurched into motion. An athletic-looking girl on the platform, pigtails and breasts swinging, ran alongside blowing kisses to a favoured soldier. Gathered in a loose crowd, mothers dabbed their faces with handkerchiefs. As our train gathered speed, I pushed my way to an open window and waved, catching my mother's eye at the last possible instant. She forced a smile onto her pale face and, raising her limp handkerchief aloft, returned my farewell. Blood red, the sun hovered over the spires of a large city. The train slowed. Life returned to the bored faces of my Kameraden. A sign drifted past the window. Krakow. Even before the train juddered to a halt, the carriage doors crashed open. We poured onto the platform and lined up in our platoons to await further instructions. "There is no transport available, we must march to our destination," explained an officer. The evening air was pleasantly mild, and I looked forward to stretching my legs after the long journey. Singing our soldiers' songs, our hobnailed boots struck the cobbled road in perfect synchrony. 1,000 feet, a single entity, a single will, the realization of my boyhood dream of joining the Leibstandarte. In the fading light, a double set of tram rails led us over a bridge spanning the river Vistula. After a short distance, they disappeared under 2 massive timber gates, each surmounted by a curving archway carrying an inscription written in Hebrew. On top of the central pillar separating the gates was the Judenstern, Star of David. As if by its own will, the gate on the right creaked open at our approach, the entrance to a dark and sinister world. Our mouths fell silent as we marched through the dingy streets. From the open windows of apartment blocks, gaunt faces stared at us with haunted eyes. Jeers of hatred rose up from behind the open doors of the dilapidated buildings. Hands with piss pots in them darted from upstairs windows to fling their contents over us. "Do not react," ordered an officer. "They have their own customs and laws here." After leaving the ghetto, we followed the rise in the road until we reached the barracks where units of the Waffen-SS division Totenkopf were billeted. We slung our backpacks onto the bunks. Those who had fallen victim to the cascades of urine cleaned themselves up as best they could. Fortunately, most of those in my platoon escaped the soaking. As I waited for sleep, the squalor of the ghetto played on my mind. Suddenly, war seemed less than heroic. In the morning, it was back to the usual routine roll call, more instructions, more training. This carried on for 4 or 5 days. Then it was back to the railway station, this time to cattle trucks with straw-covered floors. With our glorious departure from Lichterfelde just a few days earlier already seeming a million miles away, we set off on a journey made tedious by intricate detours designed to confuse enemy spies. After a few sweltering days, we came to a remote railway halt. I looked in wonder at the vast landscape, a sea of shimmering yellow sunflowers that stretched as far the eye could see. We disembarked and boarded trucks that took us along a winding lane to a barn where we would spend the night. Already I had cast my misgivings about the Jewish ghetto to the back of my mind. It was after all none of my business. Ah, the eternal naivety of youth. As nightfall approached, we gathered timber from a nearby copse and lit a blazing fire, which we sat around singing the songs we had sung 1,000 times. An elderly farmer appeared and stood, holding his distance, listening to our music. The Unterscharführer, Usha, in charge of our troop, waved for him to approach. Tentatively, the man made his way towards the welcoming glow of our fire. We smiled. One of our comrades, who knew a few words of Russian, spoke to the man. The old farmer answered in perfect German. "Do you mind if I listen?" He was an Ukrainian Volksdeutscher, an ethnic German whose ancestors had settled in the Ukraine many years earlier. Everyone laughed and looked at the Usha expectantly. He nodded and beckoned to the Ukrainian. "Come, sit with us by the fire." As we chatted, more Ukrainians joined us. Among them a woman around 25 years old. "Just a few months ago," she said, "I had 3 brothers, all of them gone, carted off by the communists, and they have long memories, these swine. 5 years ago my brothers complained about the organization of the collective system," she explained. "Immediately they were condemned as kulaks, enemies of the people. I have no idea where they are now. My letters to the authorities go unanswered. Now they've arrested almost every man under 60 as a spy. God alone knows where they all are. We here are all lucky to survive," the old man said, stretching his arm out to include his companions. "It's not 10 years since they nearly starved all of us to death. It was bad. There was cannibalism. People kidnapping children to eat. Sometimes, they say, this was done by the children's own relatives because they were driven mad by hunger." I could hardly believe that starvation could get hold amidst such fertile countryside. "Did you see any of this happen, the cannibalism?" "I didn't see any of it myself. It's not the sort of thing you would do in front of your neighbours," said the old man as he lowered his gaze. He picked up a twig lying by the fire, and with a sad, vulnerable look on his hard, weather-beaten face, held the twig in the flames until it began to smoke. "I lost 4 grandchildren to starvation, to the Golodomor as we call these evil times." In his moist eyes the reflected flames flickered brightly. Communist Party lackeys nailed posters to the walls and telegraph poles saying it was barbaric to eat children. "What caused the famine?" "Oh, it was no famine," said the old farmer, his voice rasping with disgust. "It was deliberate. We resisted the collectivization of our farms even when they made us dig our own graves and shot us for it. They stole our farming tools and crops. It was truly heartbreaking to see our people starve like that. Mothers with faces black through hunger, children with bones thin as drumsticks. God, hear my words, I hate Stalin." Now feeling more like a liberator than conqueror, I was convinced that our presence in this beautiful part of the world was entirely justified. With my own ears, I had heard the victims of Stalin's cruelty confirm that Hitler's depiction of Bolshevism was no exaggeration, or so it seemed at the time. The usher interrupted the gloom with a cheerful voice. "My friend, we are here now, so you don't have to worry about Stalin anymore." With a strong voice, he broke into song. Auf der Heide blüht ein kleines Blümelein. On the meadow grows a little flower. By the power of music, the atmosphere of despondency evaporated. One song followed the other, German and Ukrainian. Everyone was enjoying the companionship until an Untersturmführer arrived to remind us that it was time for lights out. We pleaded for permission to continue our little party. "Untersturmführer, it can't do any harm to get to know the locals," argued our usher. The Untersturmführer raised his voice. "When I give a command, I expect to be obeyed, without hesitation and without question. Do you understand? You are a soldier of the Leibstandarte." "Untersturmführer." Another of our companions ventured, but the officer immediately cut him short. "One more protest, and every single one of you will be in front of an SS court-martial." He turned on his heels and disappeared into shadows of the surrounding trees. Our usher, a ruddy-faced farmer's son, muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "He's a stickler for regulations, a real 100%er, hasn't a clue how to handle men." I should perhaps point out that the Untersturmführer's poor leadership qualities were somewhat unusual. The other leaders we served under were, without exception, fine men. Despite the order to wind up the party from the Untersturmführer, our usher decided to allow it to continue until well past midnight. Refreshed by a good night's rest, we continued our journey towards the front line, gazing like tourists at the passing landscape with the sun shining in a sky of perfect azure high above our heads. In the fields, sunflowers bloomed on stalks higher than a man. "They're beautiful," I said to the usher. "Beautiful, yes, but a death trap for infantry." A few days later, it rained hard. The dirt track roads quickly churned into to soft mud under the wheels of our vehicles. Time after time, we had to jump from our trucks to push. Once, when it seemed impossible to shift our truck from a sump of mud that filled a dip in the road, a column of prisoners, the first Russian soldiers I had seen, was enlisted to pull on ropes like a tug-of-war team to free our vehicles. The following day, the sun returned to harden the mud. As one of 674 replacements for the heavy losses suffered by the Leibstandarte during the recent Battle of Uman and the capture of Kiev, I stood in a field close to the picket fence of a fine country house that served as our regimental HQ. Sepp Dietrich, commander of the Leibstandarte, moved among us, exchanging handshakes and a few friendly words with the recruits while his officers selected men for their units. Gradually the numbers dwindled until I was one of a dozen newcomers left standing in front of Sepp Dietrich, an Untersturmführer and a Rottenführer. 4. Company is a heavy assault group equipped with 12 mortars and 12 heavy machine guns divided amongst 3 platoons, explained the Untersturmführer. Each machine gun crew has 5 Schützen. Schütze 1 carries and fires the weapon. Schütze 2 is in charge of the lafette, a tripod stand used to direct the fire from the machine gun into a defined area. Each of the remaining crew members carries 2 ammunition boxes, 600 rounds in all, and a spare barrel for the machine gun. Counting along our line, he selected 8 of my companions. "This group will leave with the Rottenführer, who will escort you to the machine gun platoons." The Untersturmführer resumed his address with Sepp Dietrich looking on. "The remaining group will join the company troop responsible for maintaining communications. This task is vital to our combat success. Your duties will include laying telephone cables and carrying messages. Our machine gun and mortar fire is directed just over the heads of the frontline infantry units, whose task is to winkle the enemy from their defensive positions into killing zones. It is an effective technique often resulting in the total annihilation of our foes, but it depends on communication, precise communication between." With furrowed brows, the Untersturmführer looked to the sky. Instinctively, I turned to see what was happening and gazed like an idiot at a growing dot swooping towards us. A powerful thud sent me tumbling over the picket fence into the shallow ditch on the other side. Sepp Dietrich was lying next to me as bullets kicked up the dust all around. A Russian fighter zoomed low overhead. "Next time you see one, dive for cover," said a smiling Sepp Dietrich. "I won't always be there to look after you."